Well, welcome to Entry-Level Exposition. This is an in-context podcast from Stonebridge Church in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. My name is Keith Knight. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm joined by the master of context himself.
Or out of context, Brandon Levering.
This is great. In this entry-level exposition series, which if you've not caught up with these, we're using the Simeon Trust Principles, First Principles, to help walk our listeners through how should you prepare a text. And again, we're not just talking about, some of these are going to be more specific to if you're preparing to teach or preach, but we also think that these are great just general principles for looking at a text and understanding a text in general, right? So some will be more specific to how you're going to present this or how you're going to preach this or teach this to an audience. But so much of it too is applicable in just our Bible study. How do we approach the text faithfully?
Yeah, how do I study and understand the Bible for myself?
Right.
And then as a parent or a disciple maker, as a teacher, so.
Yeah. And today we're actually talking about, this is like Brandon said before we went on air, this is like the namesake today of the podcast, in context. Today is all about context. And so as we go through this today, we're going to talk about the importance of context. What types of context are we looking for? And why is this a critical step to us truly understanding the passage and making any sort of sense out of how to preach or teach or understand it ourselves?
Yeah.
So, Brandon, why don't you give us the nice high level of why is context important, and how do we parse out this process of figuring out the context of a passage?
Yeah, excellent. So I was thinking about this, and I don't know if I got it to pull up. There's a lot of ways to illustrate context and what it is. One of my favorite ways is to do that by illustrating it poorly, like the opposite of. And I know I have it somewhere on my phone, but there's a game I got for Christmas this year. It's very much like Apples to Apples.
Yeah. It's like the Christian version of Apples to Apples. Right?
Yeah. And
it is a great game.
It's so
Are you
funny.
trying to figure
out
what the name
I
is?
literally had I had some example cards of it pulled up. The Bible is Funny is the name of the game.
Yeah. And
so it's basically like Apples to Apples, where you kind of pull out. It takes a Bible verse fragment,
right,
and that's what you hand out to everybody, and then there's a prompt, right? And so the prompt might be something like the vibe of my friend group when I walk into a party, and the verse fragments might be anything from like, I hate everything about this, or darkness is my only companion, or whatever. Right. I wish I had more specific examples.
Oh, it's good though.
So you're taking these funny little quips, and it illustrates what happens is context is the environment that clarifies meaning. Mm-hmm. So the location of a phrase, a word, an idea that clarifies what's intended,
right,
or what that phrase, word, idea actually means. And so when you read something in context, you are reading it in accordance with the way it was intended to be understood. And what clarifies that is the surrounding words, ideas, sentences. When you take something out of context, you're not taking it out of context, you're putting it in a different context.
Right.
So taking a phrase like darkness is my only companion from Psalm 88 and taking that out of a lament psalm and into the vibe of my friend group when I enter a party, I've given it a new context, and so now it means something different in that context.
Sure.
And so whenever this is something we do naturally all of the time. Anytime humans communicate with each other, they're using context.
Sure.
In most environments, we don't even stop to think about what the context is. We just inherently pick it up.
Right. Sure.
When we're dealing with ancient literature, or modern literature for that matter.
Yeah.
something that there's a less automatic familiarity,
Yeah.
we can, it takes a little bit extra work to make sure we're understanding the context correctly. And so that's why that's one of the critical tools that we talk about in First Principles of reading the Bible in context. Because if I'm not, if I'm uninformed of the actual context of the passage, what I'm going to do is supply my own.
Yes. Right.
And that's going to change the meaning.
Sure. Yeah.
And so we want to know, how does the context of a passage inform the meaning of the passage?
Right. And so obviously there's different types of contexts and yeah, I mean, I think it's a good example. Like you could say like, hey, I was reading the Bible the other day and it said there is no God.
Yeah.
Right.
Psalm,
okay, but what's
Psalm
the
14,
rest?
it's in there.
What's the rest of the verse say?
Mhm.
Like the fool has said in his
Yeah.
heart, there is no God. So contextually, it can be an immediate context, right?
Yes.
Or it can be literary context.
Yeah. So
right?
there's different.
What types of contexts are we talking about? Because it's
Excellent.
important for us to know those categories so that we're not just looking in just the verses right around it, but there's an expansion.
Excellent question. So there's different layers of context. If you think of like a target with a bullseye, say your word or your passage is the bullseye. Well, there's different layers around that will add clarity to what that means. And so the first and most important is literary context.
Okay.
So that would be like if you're looking at a word, try and think of an example. What does the rest of the sentence say that clarifies what that word means?
Yeah.
If you're looking at a passage, what do the passages before and after say that clarifies what that passage is about?
Right.
So literary context is how the writing around your text brings clarity to the meaning. Then there's what's called historical context. And historical context, and keep in mind, these terms will be used in different ways by different authors and different scholars. So when Charles Simeon Trust is talking about these, there's a specific definition that we try to be consistent with. So for historical context, we're talking about the first readers of that Bible passage or that book. So what was going on in the world of the first readers as they understood this? So, for instance, the letter to the Colossians, what's going on in their world. And in letters like that, you're often looking at the occasion of the letter.
Right.
Like what moved Paul to write it? There's some sort of Colossian heresy, some sort of false teaching that is tripping them up and becoming a threat to the sufficiency and supremacy of Christ. And so understanding that, and we get that by looking at the clues in the book itself very often. So historical context is the context of the first readers. Cultural context is another layer, and that's where we pay attention to the world of the people in the story.
Right.
And so for Colossians, the characters, if you will, they're real historical people, but the people being referenced are the first readers, the Colossian church. Right. But you take a narrative, like the book of Ruth, for instance.
Sure.
The people in the story of Ruth are not the same people as the first readers of Ruth. And we know that because the conclusion of Ruth ends with a genealogy that goes from Ruth all the way up to David, the king. So 5 generations later. But the book of Ruth is set in the days of the judges. That's how it opens. In the days of the judges, there is this, family. So the cultural context of the book of Ruth is the judges. What was going on during the days of the judges? How do I understand that? Read the book of Judges.
Right.
The dark, horrible time. Well, here's a contrasting moment in those days. But the historical context is going to have to do with later generations for whom David was already known and operating as king.
Right.
And so, and then the last one is what we call biblical context. And again, this one that phrase can be used in lots of different ways. When we are on this first leg of the journey of the pathway to the first readers, we're still thinking about how do the first readers understand the text. So when we talk about biblical context at this stage, we're talking about how does my passage use the Bible to make its point.
Sure.
as opposed to how do other parts of the Bible use my passage. That comes up later when we talk about theological reflection and Christ connection. So it's an important question.
Biblical
We're not
theology
there
and such,
yet.
yeah. Mhm.
We are first asking, how does my passage use the Bible to make its point? We've been in Ecclesiastes on Sunday mornings, and we were just talking about this on another episode, how much Ecclesiastes uses Genesis, both allusions to the creation and to the fall, in order to make its point about life in a fallen world.
Sure.
And so that's what I'm looking for in biblical context, quotations and allusions of other parts of the Scripture that the first readers would have had access to and been aware of. In getting its point across.
Yeah, and when you mention context, I think one of the things that's helpful too is the definitions make sense. When we get into talking about like example for like original audience, the mentions that you're making with Colossians and Ruth and stuff is understanding what type of literature you mentioned is really important, because the way in which you go about context is dependent on whether or not it's narrative or poetry or like something like Revelation, apocalyptic. It's just you have to be careful with the rules that you're putting or the boundaries that you're putting around the context in those cases. And the other thing was like even historical context, because here's one question I've gotten from people before, and I've experienced before, like when you're doing sermon prep and you get to the point of using more technical commentaries where they've got backgrounds on the books and historical backgrounds. How can we deal with it? Like when we come into a situation where we've got two different authors or two different historians making different, almost conflicting claims about the historical background of a situation, are there any sort of guidelines we should put around that? Like, because that's where I think sometimes people get confused, because you'll see those, and I think we've both seen some where somebody's claiming something about the background of a book, or then you're like, I don't think that's accurate. And then you've got maybe two or three other commentaries that aren't even agreeing on, what the occasion of the book was, or like who actually wrote the book, or what the audience was thinking at the time. So how do you navigate when it might not be clear? What's the best you can do as far as context when you have conflicting opinions on something like
question. And there's several layers to that. The first and absolutely most important piece is whether there is warrant for that background in the Scripture itself, in the text itself. Right. Like if somebody is, so I'm looking.
So don't do your historical studies before you do your actual context, your biblical context,
because the
study.
text is the final authority,
right?
And if that background is foreign to what the author's trying to get across, like a common example, and I'll probably step on a few toes here. You
do it.
The letters,
let's do it.
The letter in Revelation, the letters to the churches in Revelation, the letter to Laodicea. There's a common historical background that's often
hot and cold.
The hot and cold, right? Yeah. And so you have this famous passage where I know your works. This is Revelation 3:15.
Right.
You're neither cold nor hot. Would that you were either cold or hot. So because you're lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say I'm rich, I've prospered, and so on and so forth. And the cultural background that's often, or the historical background, this would be cultural mostly in this case, is that the location of Laodicea is in between, Hierapolis and Colossae, and one is known for its hot springs and one for its cold, and where the rivers meet. In Laodicea, it's kind of lukewarm and nasty and gross, and so, and the way that's applied then is, he's not saying, because people read this and like, why would God want somebody to be cold instead of hot? Like, we should all be hot for Jesus. And why would he spit out the lukewarm instead of the cold? And
right.
It's a puzzling metaphor. And so there's,
It is.
But the answer given based on that is that it's about usefulness. The hot springs were useful for healing and the cold were refreshing, but lukewarm is useful for nothing, and so I'm going to spit it out. Okay, usefulness. Is there anything about the usefulness of Laodicea in the rest of that text? When he goes on, he doesn't condemn them for their uselessness.
Right.
He says, For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, I need nothing, not realizing you're wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked.
Yeah.
So it's not uselessness,
Right.
but arrogance.
Right.
And so all of a sudden that background doesn't actually make sense.
Right.
It's simply, it's picking up the Mountain Dew bottle on a warm day thinking it was cold, and you take it and spitting it out because it's lukewarm. That's the picture. It's gross.
You're gross. You
make
guys are
me
gross.
want to vomit. Your works make me want to vomit because you're in your arrogance.
Right.
You are, so it's that's the picture.
everybody
it's as
can
simple
relate
as
to that.
I mean, exactly. So the first key is, does the proposed background actually have anything to do with what's going on in the passage?
That's right.
That would be one. The other key thing to look for on historical backgrounds is there any actual historical evidence?
Mm-hmm.
It's become popular in recent years, and I think people are more careful about this now than they used to be, but to have supposed backgrounds, like, Jesus's metaphor about it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. And
The size of the door.
yeah, there's this, functionally an urban legend of
I love it.
there's this gate in Jerusalem that was known as the eye of the
needle's
needle,
eye, yeah.
and the camels would have to get down on their knees to get through it because of all of their riches. So it's not
it'll preach.
It's
That'll
not
preach.
impossible for a rich
no.
man, but it's hard. There is zero historical evidence of any gate like that. It's made up.
You're ruining me. You're ruining all my sermon illustrations. No.
All right, there's ones about Jewish wedding traditions that parallel line for line with
Like blowing the
Jesus in Matthew
shofar
24
and
and I tracked that one down one time, and the earliest historical record of that tradition being described that way, and it's the whole when trying to interpret parts of the Olivet Discourse. The earliest publicized version of that, with no historical citations, is 1960.
Oh yeah.
So somebody looked at Matthew, invented a Jewish tradition that paralleled it, passed it off as a historical background. The internet caught wind of it, and all of a sudden it becomes the standard thing. But you do the digging, and it's not there. It's made up. So those are things you have to be careful with historical context.
Yeah.
Does it actually have anything to do with the passage?
Right.
And then is there any real historical evidence for it?
Right. And and you have to be really careful if you're manufacturing, because some of those things might they possibly be echoes there? Sure, but like in many cases, we almost make the text support the illustration rather than having an illustration that helps us understand the text.
Yeah, and it's okay to say I don't know about some of those,
even for
historical
pastors,
contracts.
Brandon. For pastors,
it's an earth-shattering revelation. And
we don't know all of it.
And one of the things I often tell people is, there's some background things that might be possible, but I'm not going to hang the weight of my interpretation on that.
On the one nuance,
possibility.
yeah, sure.
I'm going to hang it on what's clear.
Right.
Like one example of a helpful historical background is John 10.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, this is John 10:22. At the time of the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter. Jesus is walking in the temple, the colonnade of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." The Feast of Dedication, specifies the background. What is that talking about? Most people don't realize that's Hanukkah.
Yeah.
That is the Feast of Dedication of the temple after the Maccabean revolt, when they cleansed the temple after Antiochus Epiphanes had, defiled it by slaughtering pigs in it and so on and so forth. And so the whole connotation of the Feast of Dedication is revolution.
Right.
Like we kicked Greece out and reclaimed our land.
Right.
And dedicated and purified the temple. How long will you keep us in suspense?
Yeah,
tell us if you're the Messiah.
Right.
Because now we got Rome to kick out.
Right.
And so that fervor of revolution is a helpful background to seeing how Jesus answers it too, and that he's not the kind of, like, the security you're looking for isn't going to come in revolution.
Right.
It's going to come in reconciliation to my Father.
Right.
He's the one whose hand nobody can ever snatch you out of.
Right.
And so that deals with the text and is an actual verifiable historical background.
Right.
So that's a helpful way of how historical context can bring clarity to a passage.
Yeah, and here's one thing too that I think this question comes up at times as well. If you got let's say you're going through Exodus, and you've got a historical context that in some books says this is where they crossed, but another book says this is where they cross. And I've seen maybe pastors be like, "Oh, well, science says this is where they crossed." Like, how would we navigate something like that? Do we okay, so if the text is primary, do we bring in and be like, well, I mean, some books say this is where they cross, or do we just stick with like, hey, look, I went back and forth, I looked at the text, this is where they seem to have crossed. I look at this historical information, scientific historical information, and it seems to say it's somewhere else, but I come back to the text and I said, no, the text really seems to say this. Does the text win as far as our preaching? Even if should we be willing to just say to people, "Hey, some historical or scientific records might say here, this is where the Bible says, this is where we're going to hang our hat." Or how would you approach something like that?
And especially with, I mean, there's a couple of aspects. On the one hand, does it even matter where they cross?
Right.
But
But those are decisions that you have to make when you're thinking through the text, right? Yeah.
And so I'm going to go with the text, generally speaking. And I think one of the things that's helpful to remember first is the angle at which science is asking that question is, where is the most humanly plausible place where something like this could have happened? Where is it shallow enough? Da, 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 da.
They have a different foundation than we do.
None of those factors would actually constrain the Lord from parting the sea and enabling them to cross somewhere.
It would still be a miracle.
Exactly. So what's driving the historical explanation and are those actual factors that would be limiting for the divine explanation? Right. But then the other piece that's helpful, especially when you get into archaeology and such, that the absence of evidence is not evidence for absence. Mm-hmm. So for instance, you rewind the clock 100 plus years ago, a little bit more probably. One of the big scandals of Old Testament archaeology is that there was no record of the Hittites. Mm-hmm. And so here's a whole people group that comes up so often in the Old Testament, plays a major role in Genesis and so on and so forth. And there's no archaeological evidence of a people group of the Hittites that ever existed. And it was this big blemish, so-called, from the kind of historical critical world on the unreliability of the Old Testament.
Yep.
Until they discovered
it. Right, yeah.
You can get a PhD in Hittitology at the University of Chicago today. Great. So you go from like
vindicated.
And so just keeping in mind, just because we haven't found there's a difference between finding evidence that contradicts and not finding evidence.
Right.
If that were the standard, so much of the scientific theories out there on evolution and so on and so forth, there's no historical, they're building entire theories off a handful of bones.
Right.
And so if that's the standard you're going to apply, Scripture's way more verifiable.
Right.
And so keeping that in mind is really helpful when you're dealing with archaeological stuff.
And I think that's where I was leaning and going is if there's any question, you always prioritize the context that the Bible is clear on, and try not to get too much in the weeds of either the weird illustrations or all those things. So, okay, so then moving on in terms of other context, then how can we be more careful with the overall like biblical context, like from passage to passage, like when do we reach too much to pull a context, a biblical context into a passage where it may not apply? Are there ways in we can do that? Which we can do that?
That's a great question. And again, so much, and I love the way that Simeon frames the question. We must understand how the context informs the meaning of the passage. So the passage is still the standard, what we're trying to understand. And so if I'm pulling on a biblical context thing that doesn't actually inform it, or that actually would take it in a different direction than what the passage is actually trying to say, that's one of the things I would be like, am I reading too much into this?
Right.
I'm trying to think of examples to make that more helpful. And it's also tricky. Sometimes you can have, you think of John 2 as an example. Sometimes you have just a small allusion, but it's picking up the whole context of the passage that it's referring to.
Right,
so when Jesus is cleansing the temple in John 2, I can find it here. He quotes Psalm 69, or John does. Hold on, let me see here. The Passover of the Jews is at hand. Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he's driving out the money changers and so on. Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. So Jesus is quoting Jeremiah there.
Right.
And his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house has consumed me. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, that, it's a citation from Psalm 69:9. Zeal for your house has consumed me. So one might just simply say, oh, that reminds me of a verse about zeal in the temple, and have nothing there. But when you look at Psalm 69, it's the zeal of the lone faithful worshiper, the only one who has remained faithful. Like, I'm all alone, and it's this cry for help, because he's been abandoned and rejected, and he is bearing reproach for God's name. For it is, verse 7, for it is for your sake that I've become reproach, that dishonor has covered my face. I've become a stranger to my brothers, an alien to my mother's son. For zeal for your house has consumed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. The lone faithful worshiper who's been abandoned by the people of God, and who endures the reproach of God on his behalf. When Jesus is going up there cleansing the temple, he's the only faithful Israelite in the room.
Right.
And it's this picture of he's not being arrogant or brash. He is lamenting. So he's living out Psalm 69 in that moment, basically. So there's a biblical context that helps me understand, why is he so exercised here? Because he's living out Psalm 69 in terms of the lone faithful Israelite who is zealous for the Lord's house. So that's a helpful example.
Sure.
I'm trying to think of unhelpful ones. Are you familiar with ones that have kind of gone too far, or maybe you're more spurious or superficial?
One of my warnings is always to just like anytime you're dealing with apocalyptic literature, the tendency is to try to make all the apocalyptic passages be the same thing, or lean too hard into what you're already believing, and then taking apocalyptic passages and making them fit together because they sound similar.
Yeah.
So like using Daniel, Revelation, maybe the end of Zechariah, Ezekiel, and mashing them all together and saying like, hey, but most of the times you have an idea of how you sort of think things are supposed to go. Like if you grew up dispensational, you've already got this background. You've got a context that needs to be dropped, so that you can actually pick up a fresh context that's coming direct. And I know, like, I'm not trying to hurt people's feelings, but having grown up in it, I think sometimes we become a slave to an idea that was created, and then impose the idea, that framework that comes from a historical framework of Christians trying to make sense of things, and then imposing a completely different theology that's already there onto texts that are hard to understand in general. And when we do that, we just perpetuate and I'll be honest, right now, at this point in time in Christianity, there's a number of YouTube channels that they're grabbing everything from every eschatology and just smashing it together. And they're doing that without understanding context.
They're not understanding the historical. What does that? What did that prophecy mean in its original book? How is it pointing forward? And yeah, so often, and this is another episode we'll get into called Text and Framework, right?
Right.
And what functionally happens when our framework is allowed to exert its influence over our text rather than the text to our framework, what happens is we are actually replacing the context with a different context, the new context of my theological framework.
Right.
Now everything slots into that, and so I can take verses that have, I mean, you take, for instance, like with Mormonism, to just kind of shift the example, you've got prophecies in Ezekiel about the two sticks being, and one is the Book of Mormon and the other is the Bible or something. I mean, it's complete hogwash on 1,000 levels.
Right.
But the framework of Mormonism takes it out of the original context and adds different meaning to it, and then uses it that way. Christians do that in a lot of ways as well. Right. So if one of the most important lessons I ever learned when I was learning how to read and interpret the Bible, if you are not clued into the context, you will create your own.
Oh, for sure.
So being clued into the context, frankly, some people might think, well, that's just kind of a straitjacket, right? Or I like a spirit-led interpretation of the scriptures and so on.
You keep using the word, and I don't think it means what you think it means.
I mean, reading in context is an act of love.
Yes.
It's an act of love. Imagine taking your wife's words out of context.
I mean, I've done that.
and how that makes her feel, right?
Yeah.
Reading in context is an act of love. If the Spirit of God has already gone to the trouble to give us the Word of God in its present shape, then how is it loving to ignore that present shape and supply our own context that may have nothing to do with what's been said?
Yeah.
That's not love. That's not spirituality.
No.
It's something entirely different.
Yeah, and it's also why the thing I love about this part of the Simeon Trust, about the principles, is one of the things that I find to be rich, like when I'm able to be in a room with other people talking about the same passage, and then if you bring up, well, here's what I found, and somebody says, I don't see that anywhere in there, that there's this idea that this context that seems to be there is actually there, and you're getting challenged by people who are in the room who have read the same text, and they're like, well, what about this? And that just to say, like, I think there are going to be times where, if we're honest with ourselves, we don't know our own biases.
Totally.
And so when we're not cognizant of our own biases, we really need to be asking other people to wait. Do you see this? Like, it's why if I'm ever shaky on something before I go to preach it, I'm gonna come to you and be like, hey, like that time where I tried to find your sermon that didn't exist to make sure I wasn't preaching something else already. I'm like, I got to know where he lands on the context of this, because it was a heavy historical and biblical context sermon.
Yeah,
like it was a biblical theology sermon, basically.
It was.
And if you and I aren't on the same page in that, and I get up and say something that's completely out of pocket, then you're in the position of being like, you have to say something.
And now I got to do damage control.
Like, okay, how am I gonna like give the actual context if you're getting so all that to say, this is never again is when we think of these things, a lot of times we think of our personal Bible study or our own understanding, but all of these things are so much better done in community with other people who are seeking to understand those same passages. So if I might go to use that lukewarm illustration, somebody else says, no. Actually, here's a better one.
Yeah, exactly. And And the other thing I would say on all of this is, because one of the questions is, okay, well, how do I find it, right? Do I have to have like a library of historical artifacts and so on and so forth? The number one place to look for historical and cultural context is still the text itself.
Yeah.
Like very often
Embedded in there.
It's embedded in there. The clues are in there, especially like occasion in Paul's epistles. That's going to be, what problems is he talking about and addressing? That's the occasion, right? Or even in Ruth, like there are cultural things, like when Boaz takes his sandal off and hands it to the person. The author is anticipating that you won't have a clue why he did that, and so actually includes a little parenthetical explanation. By the way, this is how you sold land back then. We used pen and paper; they used a sandal. So in the scriptures, that is your number one best place to look for context. For biblical context, it's your cross-reference section. There are tools out there that can be helpful. A good commentary is a helpful place to look for historical and cultural context. A good study Bible is a good place. Like ESV Study Bible is great. Where I would not recommend you to look is simply Googling it.
Yes.
Because that's where most people find the more spurious examples of context that are just made up. So internet, unless it's like an actual journal or respected
JSTOR,
publication, the internet is not usually your friend in figuring out biblical context. You want to look for vetted sources typically, and that if the beauty of the internet is anybody can say anything they want. The danger of the internet is anybody can say anything they want, and publications are supposed to at least function in a sort of gatekeeping. Like, we're not going to let anything crazy and inaccurate get out there. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that it doesn't slip through. But in general, more eyes have been on that as opposed to some dude in his jammies just making something up and publishing it, right? And so credible publications can be a helpful resource.
So I think the baseline guideline for context is check out all the 4 different areas of context that we mentioned. You want to check all those out. If these things are showing up, obviously you will. There's context you will see that is obvious, and you stick to that as much as possible. If it seems somewhat spurious or not as sure, don't go out on a limb to make it be that. Like get some counsel, good, like you said, good commentaries. Talk to your pastor. Talk to a friend that's studying. Invite somebody else to study the text with you and dig through the Bible, looking for if you got a Bible with cross references, use the cross references as best you can.
One more great resource. There's a book called Out of Context by Richard Schultz. He's a professor I actually worked for back in grad school, and he took basically one of his assignments for when he taught Bible. He just retired like a few weeks ago. 40 years as a Bible teacher.
That's amazing.
And one of his assignments for his students is when he was teaching them context was to find examples of passages taken out of context in published material. And so he collected those over like 30 years of teaching and then put together basically, D.A. Carson has this book called Exegetical Fallacies, which is another great one.
Book.
This is kind of an exegetical fallacies for lay Bible readers, and just a bunch of categories of out of context mistakes and examples of them.
That's amazing.
It's I
got to get that book.
It's great. I've got it on my shelf if you want to borrow it.
I think I'll just get my own, and then that's a book that I would buy a bunch of and just hand about to people.
It's really helpful. And I mean, it's a bit of a slap in the face.
Sure,
times.
I'm sure.
And I think at least in one place, I think he uses some of his own early work, and such. But it's a super helpful. Illustrating ways this commonly happens.
And at the end of the day, we all want to encourage, if you're listening to this, we're not trying to do this so that we can be the smartest Bible teacher in the room. We're doing this because we want to be faithful to the text. We don't want to go beyond. We don't want to fall short of what the text is saying. We don't go beyond what the text is saying. Everything that the Lord has put in His Word is sufficient for us to make us holy, to equip us So we need to make sure that as we're studying it, we're putting the appropriate guidelines around it that God has already given to us. He's closed that canon, and he's given us the tools to use to figure it out. So, so do your best, and make sure, again, like everything that we're doing is in context. We'll continue in this series. I think next time we're going to talk about structures, like how do we look at the structure of a passage and put that together. That one will be fun, because I think that's where a lot of people maybe need the most encouragement and help. So until next time, keep everything in context.